Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. The remote farming community of Murdock, Nebraska, seemed to be the least likely setting for one of the heartland's most ruthless and bloody double murders in decades. In fact, the little town had gone more than a century without a single homicide. But on the night of Easter 2006, Wayne and Sharmon Stock were brutally murdered in their own home. The murders garnered sensational front-page headlines and drew immediate statewide attention. Practically everybody around Murdock was filled with fear, panic, and outrage. Who killed Wayne and Sharmon Stock? What was their motive? The Stocks were the essence of Nebraska's all-American farm family, self-made, God-fearing, and of high moral character. Barely a week into this double murder investigation, 2 arrests brought a sense of relief to the victim's family and to local residents. The case appeared to fall neatly into place when a tiny speck of murder victim Wayne Stock's blood appeared in the alleged getaway car. Then, an obscure clue left at the crime scene took the investigation down a totally different path, stretching into Iowa, Louisiana, New York, Texas, and Wisconsin. By the time this investigation was over, the charges against the original suspects were dismissed, and 2 new individuals emerged from the shadows. Author John Ferrick covered the Stock murders from the very beginning, including all of the trial proceedings. When the criminal prosecution finally ended in 2007, he remained puzzled by one nagging question. Why was the blood of victim Wayne Stock in a car that was ultimately proven to have no connection to the murders? Over the next few years, the astonishing bloodied lies were revealed, culminating in a law enforcement scandal that turned the case on its head and destroyed the career of Nebraska's celebrated CSI director, David Kofod. The book that we're featuring this evening is Bloody Lies, a CSI scandal in the heartland, with my special guest, investigative journalist and author, John Ferrick. Welcome to the program, and thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. John Ferrick.
Thanks very much, Dan. Very happy to be here.
Thank you very much. Incredible book and an incredible case. And let's get right to this. Normally I ask people why they felt compelled to write this book. In this case, let me ask the question about your background and your connection to this area and to this story, and your personal background as an investigative journalist, and to tell us why, without asking that question, why you felt compelled to write this book. So give us your background and your connection to this area and this story.
Yeah, Dan. Let's see. Long and short, I grew up in Joliet and Plainfield, Illinois, and at a young age, pretty much 14 or 15, I set my sights on becoming a journalist. At that point in time, I was interested in sports, went to college at Eastern Illinois University, and really became interested and enamored with investigative journalism and hard news coverage. And that's kind of where my professional career went from there on out. I always took a strong interest in investigative reporting, public spending, but then I also realized that public safety, covering the court system, was really fascinating to me, and I was really interested in digging into cases and really learning more and more and more about the criminal justice system, learning about law enforcement, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, just how the whole system operated. And I had covered a case, or kind of picked up the end of this case when I was at my first job in South Bend, Indiana, where I was a regional reporter. And there was a case involving a man named Edgar Garrett. And Ed Garrett went on trial for a murder of his daughter. And what was really fascinating about the case is that it was the first case that the county prosecutor had lost in that county in 25 years. And it was because of the videotaped confession of the suspect that really blew up in the prosecutor's face. The confession didn't match with the real evidence in the case. And it turned out that this Edgar Garrett was coerced into making a false confession. So that case kind of always stuck with me because I at that point in time, I had heard a lot of people say there's no way anybody would ever confess to a murder that didn't do it. So years later, 2006, by that point in time, I had been working as a regional reporter and doing a lot of investigative journalism at the Omaha World-Herald, which is Nebraska's largest newspaper. And part of my area of coverage was southeastern Nebraska. And a lot of small towns, some of these towns had 500 to 1,000 people. The county seat had about 7,000 people. The county itself was about 25,000. This is an area about 25 miles south of Omaha, which is a big metropolitan city of about 500,000. The metro area is about 1 million people. But when you get to Plattsmouth and Cass County, you're really kind of in farm country in Nebraska. And that's this whole area where it was part of my coverage area, where I really kind of cherry-picked for the biggest and best stories that I thought would have regional impact and be of interest across the whole state of Nebraska. And some of those cases involved criminal justice and crimes. And that's kind of what happened here, whereas by 2006, I knew a lot of the law enforcement officials pretty well, first-name basis. You know, they knew me, and likewise, same way with the prosecutor and the court officials. And it was just a shock on Monday, the day after Easter, when word got out later in the day that there happened to be a double murder outside of Murdock, Nebraska, a town of about 270 people. It just, just everybody was jarred and floored and couldn't believe it. And, and I knew, just again, based on several years as a reporter and an investigative journalist, my instincts went up, and I knew that this was an important story that needed to be covered.
Now, part of this importance and is also the nature of the murder itself. So for our audience, if you don't mind, tell us the details of the actual murder itself. What officials actually found? Don't give too much away, but what officials, not officials found, because tell us who discovered the bodies and what was discovered.
It was around 9 a.m, and Andy Stock, who was in his mid to late 20s at the time. Andy was a farmer. His father was a farmer, and the Stocks lived on a pretty good-sized farm, about 1,000 acres or so, out in rural Murdock, Nebraska. They ran a stock hay company, which was a pretty good little hay and alfalfa business. And so Andy went out to the farm on Monday morning to go to work, help his dad out. And he gets to the farmhouse, and there's no activity, which is unusual because Mom and Dad usually got up pretty early. And so Andy's looking around for his mom, Sharmon Stock, age 55, and his father, Wayne, who's 58, and can't find them anywhere throughout the house, which is unusual. So he goes outside, figuring maybe his dad's out tinkering with one of the farm machinery or tractors, checks the outbuildings, and can't find his father out there either. Eventually, Andy goes upstairs, figuring maybe his dad's upstairs. He had an office upstairs where he did a lot of his paperwork for the farm business, and no sooner does Andy start to get up the stairs, but he finds his father face down in a pool of blood. Just a horrific pool of blood. And there's a handful of red shotgun shells, sprawled across the body, and actually another live shell actually that was left on the carpet. So Andy just is terrified, obviously, and just runs back down the stairs, and eventually runs out to his truck and grabs his cell phone and calls 911, and that's what caused law enforcement, Cass County Sheriff's Office, and eventually the Nebraska State Patrol, and eventually the Douglas County Crime Lab to all respond within minutes to over several hours to descend upon the property and the farmhouse, this bloody, awful carnage that had just taken place in an area of Murdock and in an area of Nebraska that just was totally unexpected, Dan.
Now the police are called, and so what did they find? What did they determine in terms of the murder? How this couple was murdered? What was the weapon? Tell us about those first details that they encounter, and the actually grisly sight. So what do they encounter?
Well, when they get there, they ultimately go up the stairs, and again, Andy had only found his father. He was so horrified by what happened that he ran down the stairs. So his mom was still missing. Nobody knew where she was at. At first, the thinking was maybe she drove up the road, but to visit family, but her car was still in the driveway. Cass County Sheriff's Office gets to the scene. They search the property. Eventually, the obvious. They went up the stairs and they found Wayne Stock in a pool of blood, and it was just a horrific sight. His head had been he had taken at least two. He had taken 2 shots to the back of his head, and just basically, the back of his head was blown off. Blood was everywhere throughout the walls. He's, like I said, he was sprawled, kind of tied up or tangled up in his bed sheets. He was asleep shortly before this horrific intrusion had occurred. The Cass County Sheriff's Office eventually worked their way into the bedroom, and that's where they found Wayne's wife, Sharmon. And she was found along the bedside, tangled up in a telephone. It turned out that she was trying to make a desperate call to 911 to notify the sheriff's office, to notify law enforcement that there were invaders that had entered their bedroom and barged into the room in the middle of the night. But the killers were able to shoot her through the middle of her face, and she just fell down and died instantly. One single shot. Now, it was pretty clear, based on the crime scene, what kind of weapon was involved in this. It was for sure a shotgun, and it was pretty obvious it was also a 12-gauge shotgun as well, Dan. Just based on the fact that there were several shells that were left at the crime scene that law enforcement was able to collect and retrieve from the crime scene. And they also knew that this was not a murder-suicide because the shotgun that was used in the crime was nowhere to be found. So law enforcement had some key evidence that was left at the crime scene, so they didn't need to spend an incredible amount of time trying to figure out, if this was a pistol or a certain type of handgun. They clearly knew what kind of weapon this was that they were looking for. And based on the crime scene, just based on how bloody and awful things were, it was clear that the Stokes were taken by surprise. They were still wearing their pajamas, so it was pretty obvious that they were killed sometime late at night or in the middle of the night after they had gone to sleep.
Now, what was the evidence pointing to in terms of number of weapons or number of perpetrators before we get into any, and was there any evidence of theft as a motive?
Let me back up on that. Those are great questions. The evidence of multiple intruders, that becomes clear by the end of the day on this first day of the investigation, the crime lab that ultimately was called in to help process the scene and collect evidence, they had done this before, and they were smart enough to realize that in the upstairs hallway where Wayne Stock's body was found, and it's a narrow hallway, white walls, but there was an outline or a silhouette of a human being, and it was clear to the crime scene analysts, the bloodstain experts, that this was a shadow or a silhouette of a second person. This person had to be standing off to the side at the time that their co-conspirator or accomplice had fired one of the shots into the back of Wayne's head. So it becomes clear that there has to be two perpetrators involved in these crimes. It wasn't immediately clear, though, Dan, at that point in time that there were two guns. That doesn't become clear until many, many months later, actually. So law enforcement is working off of the premise that there's two perpetrators, two people that are there at the scene. They're still working off of the theory, though, that it's one gun and that it's a 12-gauge shotgun that somebody had used in these crimes. Now, your question about was there any sign of robbery, I believe is what you asked, right?
Right.
The back of the property really stood out to the crime scene analyst. There was one window in the back of the property near Wayne and Sharmon Stock's wooden patio. There was a window, and this was a window that led to their laundry room. And this window was propped open. And not only that, but the screen, the exterior screen for this window had been pried off and was just left laying in a bed of rocks right underneath the window. And closer examination of this window screen showed that clearly somebody had taken it off, or kind of punctured a little hole into it, which ultimately would have helped them pry it off. And so one of the crime scene analysts was taking several photographs of the property. That was part of his assignment and frankly his specialty. And he was asking around, as far as he clearly was focused and really interested in this window, because, as he would say later, this was about the only thing that really stood out on the exterior of the property that really was unusual and seemed to infer that this is the point of entry for whoever the intruders/killers were. But for whatever reason, some of the local sheriff's investigators really kind of waved him off, basically, as far as just indicated to him that this window, don't really spend your time focused in on this window. It really didn't fit their theory that they were working off of as far as how the murders and how the intrusion happened. They worked off of the premise that the front door, which the interior door was left wide open, they were convinced that the killer had just walked right into the killers, I should say, but had walked right in through the front door and went up the stairs, found Wayne and Sharmon in their bed, and just blew them away at point-blank range with a 12-gauge shotgun, and then ran out or scampered down the stairs and ran back out the house. And part of the reason why I think that they worked off of that theory from the get-go was the fact that all the other rooms in the farmhouse, if you looked around, starting with the kitchen, Wayne and the living room, dining room, everywhere else, Wayne and Sharmon Stock had a very immaculate and tidy farmhouse, and this was a nice farmhouse. It had been in the family for several generations. It was early 1900s home, and it had actually undergone some renovations over the years too. So it really looked nice, and it was a nice house. And even when law enforcement got to the farmhouse to investigate the murders, the rest of the house was immaculate, and that signified to to the cops that whoever did this crime must have clearly been intent on revenge, and there didn't seem like that there was anything of value that was stolen. None of the rooms were ransacked. There was no obvious sign that any money had been taken or any jewelry. In fact, Wayne Sharmon Stock's jewelry was left out in plain view, just a couple feet away from her body, and Wayne's wallet was right across the hallway from his body, and
right.
in his computer, just in his office area. And again, no money was taken. So law enforcement worked off of the theory that this was not about robbery, Dan, and they worked off the theory that this clearly had to be some type of premeditated, orchestrated, well-planned out double murder that happened in the middle of the night. That's the way it seemed to them at first.
Let me go back just a little bit because I think it's a little bit important to ask you where the Stocks, Wayne and Sharmon, were earlier in the evening, and then to ask this question because I think it's important. Where did the police have this idea that the door was open, and did they get any kind of that idea from having the son, Andy, go there earlier and go in that door? And did he tell them that the door was open? Did he unlock it? Did he have a key? What was the information that he gave to them? And how, if you can tell us, how would they have thought that was the entry point?
Well, the first part of your question, Dan, as far as where people were at earlier before the murder, Wayne and Sharmon were at Wayne's mother's place, which is just around the bend, probably a quarter mile or so away. She lived on a farm, or actually her house was right around the bend, and the Stock family had a family gathering on Easter Sunday over there. There was about, I'd say, no more than 10 to 12 relatives that were over there, including Wayne's only sister, Barb Livers, and her husband, Dave, and their oldest son, Matt Livers. So Wayne's nephew was at this family gathering. And the family gathering broke up around dinner time, I think 4:30 or 5 o'clock or so. And from there, Wayne and Sharmon went back to their house, and they had some of their grandkids over around dinner time, and did some Easter egg hunts around the property, and just had a great time with their grandkids, before ultimately retiring to bed around 10:30 or so. Let's see. What was the other part of your question?
Well, when Andy went there the next morning and looked around and finally entered the house, did he have a key to the house, or was the door unlocked? How did he find the house? To try to surmise why the police would dismiss the idea that they came through a window, they must have been pretty positive about that door. Why would they think that? What was the information that Andy gave them regarding how he got there? And did he have a key? What was that information?
Yeah, I'm going off of memory on that. I know that he surely would have had a key. He pulled up in his truck and parked kind of behind the house, and if I'm not mistaken, he actually would have had to use his key to get into the back door. Because I remember in the aftermath, it was clear. Law enforcement made it plainly clear that the Stock's home was locked at all the doors were locked at the time of the crime. So Andy clearly had to go inside the house, on his own, and I'm pretty sure that when he runs out of the house, that he probably would have run out that front door. So it's I'm not really sure exactly as far as how that scenario goes as far as with Andy, and frankly, I don't think that they spent very much time trying to clarify that point too, Dan, as far as just whether or not Andy went out the back door or did he go out the front door. But the fact is that the interior front door was open. It's probably likely that one of the intruders ran out that front door based on the fact that when they ran out to their vehicle, they dropped some key pieces of evidence. I don't know if you want me to get into that yet or later. But
not quite yet. We unfold that when it need be. So now what we have is this credible murder. Do they have any idea about a getaway vehicle? And again, tell us what their theory is very quickly, and within how long do they have a theory? And then from that theory, of course, comes this incredible tale. But tell us about this theory, and who are the people that come up with this theory, the players in this grand theory, and tell us about that.
Well, there was a couple of newspaper carriers. Justin Hergenrader was one of them, and his girlfriend at the time, Tamara Jeffrey. And they came forward a day or two after the murders had happened, after this was all over the news. They were trying to be helpful, and they remembered that on the night of the crime, when they were delivering their newspapers between 3:30 and 4 a.m., they had driven to the Stock's farmhouse, like always, to bring them their Monday morning newspaper. And when they were going to that farmhouse, Tamara had noticed a car that was parked at a cemetery about a mile down the road from the Stock's farmhouse. And later on that evening, when they were finishing up their route, the same car nearly ran them off the road, and it was speeding, and it was heading toward the city of Lincoln, bright lights. And so law enforcement becomes convinced that this was an incredible tip, and in their mind, this had to be the killer's getaway vehicle, that the killers were heading back to the city of Lincoln, and they focused in on the fact that they had also remembered that Wayne and Sharmon Stock's nephew, Matt Livers, also lived in the city of Lincoln, Dan.
Mm-hmm. Now tell us about Matt Livers, because they have this idea. Now tell us, they have the theory that it might be somebody from their own family. They take this tip, and now what do they do with this idea that it might be a person named Matt Livers?
Well, they were convinced that Matt Livers seemed like the logical suspect because he had had some disagreements over the years. He was kind of estranged from his aunt and uncle, and there had also been some issues over the years that had bubbled up involving a property Matt's grandmother's house, where Matt used to live there, down in the basement, and apparently he had become kind of a burden for the family, for his grandmother. She didn't mind him living there, but Wayne and Sharmon ultimately decided to intervene and kind of kicked him out of the house. Didn't want him living there. So that caused some tensions and rift in the family. And again, he had spent Easter Sunday with the family at the Easter Sunday gathering. Certain family members immediately just jumped to the conclusion, Dan, that this was a premeditated, cold-blooded killing, and that Matt, since he was the black sheep of the family, had to be responsible. And you had a situation where somewhere between at least a half a dozen different extended family members were interviewed by local law enforcement on the day of the murders, so later in the day at one of their houses. And all of them, one after one, just said that they were convinced that Matt Livers had to be responsible for these murders. There was no, these were all rumor and innuendo. There was no hard evidence at this point in time. There was no eyewitnesses that had come forward to say Matt Livers was responsible. But law enforcement becomes convinced that Matt Livers has to be this awful bad guy, this monster that had somehow pulled this double murder off in the middle of the night.
Now, tell us about Matt Livers, who he really is in terms of character. Tell us about Matt Livers and if he has any criminal record.
Matt Livers was 28 years old at the time that this had all unfolded. And at that point in time, Matt did not even have a speeding ticket on his record. He had kind of a not a tough upbringing, but just he was in special education throughout his whole schooling. He was some people would characterize him as slow, but he had a little bit of a diminished capacity, where his IQ level was around 70 or so, and just growing up in school, he had some tough times where kids would make fun of him, but he always tried to move past this, and he really wanted to do the best that he could for himself, but he also tried to compare himself to his family members, and and certain family members really had a lot more going for them than he had. But at the time that this had happened, he was struggling. He had lost a job. He had recently been fired from a security job position that he had. The situation was that I believe he kicked the door real hard. He was angry about something at work, and ultimately kicked a hole in the door at this pharmaceutical plant. So he had been fired from his job about a month prior to these murders, and law enforcement becomes convinced that the fact that he was fired, unemployed, and had kicked a hole in his door, that showed violent tendencies and just unbelievable anger, and it kind of snowballs into the theory that, this is the same guy that ultimately is going to go back to his uncle and aunt's farmhouse late on Easter Sunday night, just hours after he had spent some time with them earlier that day at this Easter family gathering.
Now, how do they proceed in terms of questioning him? Does he want a lawyer, request a lawyer? Do they tell him about that? And pardon me, but I wanted to ask this one question too. When you say that the family members, 6 of them or so, had stated that, well, if you want to talk about a suspect, this Matt, our nephew, the nephew of Wayne, is the likely suspect. Did the police already have this idea in their head and prompt, knowing as time goes on, the audience will understand why I'm asking this question. Was there prompting by the police? Did they already have the idea that it could be a family member? It's not really contained in the book, but was there prompting? Which came first, the idea or the idea from the relatives?
I think it had to be a combination of both, because even some of the crime lab personnel that showed up at the crime scene and looked at the carnage in the hallway, their first suspicion was that this was personal. I remember that comes up a lot, as far as even some experts, that had been to numerous crime scenes that came and helped on this case. The theory was at first that this was a deeply personal type of revenge kind of killing. So when you're working off of that theory, law enforcement, Cass County Sheriff's Office did think immediately that it probably was somebody closely connected to Wayne and Sharmon Stock. And again, within a matter of hours, they're sitting down with several family members, distraught, but all the family members that they spoke with were very persuasive, highly persuasive, in convincing them that you need to spend your time focused in on Matt Livers. And that just becomes the way that it ultimately goes. They think, they're convinced that the family's presenting them with a great, solid suspect, and they really disregard other possible scenarios as far as what could have happened and what may have happened. And basically Matt becomes suspect number 1, but there isn't any other people that are even being looked at. And you asked about, does Matt lawyer up or anything like that? No, it's actually a matter of that same night after the two Cass County Sheriff's investigators met with the grieving and distraught family members. Later that night, they go back to the grandma's house, and they went over there asking, is Matt Liver still over there? And Matt had already left to go home, back to Lincoln. His mom gets on the phone, calls him up on his cell phone, and he proceeds to drive back to his grandma's house, back to Murdock late that night. And he rides and gets into a squad car with two of the investigators, rides around with them for. They ultimately take him over to a fire station to do an interview. But no, he's more than willing and compliant as far as being candid with them, answering any and all questions they have, giving them ultimately over the next several days, providing them with DNA samples and hair samples, just anything that they need. Matt's more than willing to comply and help them out in the investigation. And it's really because he's, in his mind, he's convinced that he's helping them get closer to finding out who the real killer or killers are. He's aware that they're looking at him as a suspect, but he knows he believes he didn't do the crime. So why does he need to get a lawyer? Why does he need to not participate in any interviews that the sheriff's office and the state patrol, are asking of him at that point in time, Dan?
Did he offer any alibi? And if there was an alibi offered, were any witnesses interviewed?
Yeah, Matt maintained that he was at home the entire night of the murders, and he actually had to get up that very next morning. He had a phone interview for a job interview. It was actually for the Schneider National, which are the big orange trucks that you see driving all over North America,
right,
based out of Wisconsin. But he had a phone interview that very next morning with this trucking company, and so he had to get up really early and do this phone interview with them. And that's what he maintained, that he was in bed, went to bed, and was asleep that entire night. And he had his two roommates. One was his fiancée at the time, eventual wife, Sarah Schneider, and Sarah and Matt slept in the same bed. And she remembered going to bed around the same time that Matt went to bed. I think it was around 11 or 11:30. And she woke up first that next morning, and insisted that Matt was in bed wearing his pajamas, just like he was wearing his pajamas and laying in bed next to her when they went to bed the previous night. There was also another roommate that they had, and her name was Susan Gill. And Susan also was, like Matt's fiancée, also worked as a nurse. And Susan came home sometime late that night or in the middle of the night. I can't remember exactly. But Susan insisted as well that Matt Livers was home, and and his vehicles were there the entire time. When she got home, from her late night work shift. So you had two other roommates, eyewitnesses, alibi witnesses is better proper terminology, but two other alibi witnesses that were interviewed by law enforcement, and they maintained that Matt Livers, was home at the time of the crime, but they were ultimately disregarded and not taken seriously.
So they didn't answer to that. How did they reconcile that? They didn't. They just moved on and proceeded to question Matt Livers.
The theory was that they just worked off of the theory that maybe these women were lying for them, trying to cover for them, or him, I should say, for Matt. But and the other scenario was too that they thought that maybe they didn't know that Matt somehow sneaked out of his house in Lincoln, and was gone for a few hours, and ultimately, returned and slipped back in the bed. So, whatever reason, they just really didn't take it seriously. The possibility that these two other roommates of Matt's, were believable, or they just decided not to just put that much faith and stock into that. They were convinced that Matt was able to sneak out of that his house in Lincoln and ultimately drive the 35 miles or so to the farmhouse and commit the murders and make it back home before the next morning.
Now they outline their theory eventually with Matt, but how he responds is that he denies, and he denies dozens of times. So try to take us into how it eventually turns around, and in what manner do they get him to turn around and get this into a confession from a person who's trying to help out the police. He knows he's innocent, to a confession. Tell us about that process, because I think it's important.
Yeah, so we're basically about a week into the murder investigation. We're starting the second week of the case. It's about the 8th day since the murders had happened, and Matt Livers had gotten into a squad car with the two lead investigators. They picked him up at his house. He was not under arrest at that point in time, but they drove him to the sheriff's office in Plattsmouth, Nebraska, for an interrogation. And the hope was that they were going to get him to finally confess to these crimes. But over several hours, the investigators were pretty frustrated. Matt, as you said, denied over and over that he had anything to do with these murders. So they asked him if he'd be willing to take a polygraph test, a lie detector test, to prove his innocence. And Matt said, sure, absolutely. And the two investigators already had, one of their cohorts, a Nebraska State Patrol investigator, Charlie O'Callahan, on standby. And Charlie was just right around the other office, and he was waiting to give Matt his polygraph test. And so ultimately, Matt takes this polygraph test with Charlie O'Callahan. Charlie leaves the room after the test is done, and this time the two lead investigators return to the room, and before they were kind of playing the Mr. Nice Guy approach, this time they just came back into the room, and the looks on their eyes just scared the daylights out of Matt Livers, and they just start yelling at him and telling him that we're seeing another side of you. It's time for you to confess. We know that you're up to your ears in this thing, and he still denies that he's involved. But over the next several minutes and hours, Matt just kind of wilts under pressure, and he feels trapped in the situation. And one of the investigators, Earl Skank, ultimately just tells him, Earl's theory about how the murders happened. And it basically breaks it down into a right or wrong set of questions. I think it's probably about 8 to 10 different questions. And Earl asks Matt, right or wrong, you did this. Right or wrong, you did this. And Matt answers right to every single question. And that, at first, that's Matt's confession. At that point in time, it's incredible as this is probably for a lot of our listeners to believe, but Matt was thinking at that point in time, if he confessed to these crimes, that he was going to get to go home that night, that these two investigators, were going to drive him home after he had confessed to the murders. And again, that's just with Matt's, mental capacity. He was thinking that this is the way it was going to go, but that wasn't the way it was going to go. And he also knew at that point in time, though, he knew a lot of the crime scene evidence as far as just kind of what had happened, because other family members had talked to his mom and dad about what some of the evidence was that was found at the crime scene, including the fact that a shotgun shells were found and the shotgun was used. So there's a couple aspects of his, quote, confession that investigators think are bullseyes, but in reality, Matt was telling them stuff that he had already heard, and again, to try to placate them. But again, ultimately over several hours, he wilts under pressure, and he confesses. And at first, he takes credit for committing the murders by himself, that he did it, and he did it alone. Now, the two investigators realized, again, thinking back to the upstairs hallway, they knew that there was a second person involved in this crime. So they ultimately, pressed Matt for more details as far as who could have been his accomplice. And he names one of his cousins, a fellow by the name of Nick Sampson.
And what does he say Nick did, and his entire involvement? What was his entire involvement according to Matt Livers?
Well, it ultimately changes, and it actually evolves over several hours. In fact, actually even until the next morning. I should say the next afternoon while Matt's still in jail. But at first it was that Nick had furnished the shotgun that was used in the murders, and that Nick had furnished the getaway vehicle, which was a car that Nick's brother, a fellow by the name of Will Sampson, but Matt maintained that Nick had borrowed or obtained Will's car, and that was the car that Matt and Nick had borrowed and used to commit the murders and use as the getaway car. So that's the original statement that Matt makes. It evolves to being that Nick was serving as his lookout at the farm while Matt went upstairs to commit the murders, to eventually that Nick had actually allegedly had fired the final shot into the back of Wayne Stock's skull in the hallway. But as soon as Matt had implicated his cousin Nick Sampson during that interrogation, Cass County Sheriff's Office made a phone call to the Nebraska State Patrol, and they ultimately raided a small town bar in Murdock, Nebraska, where Nick Sampson had worked in a part-time job as a kitchen cook, and they went out and pulled Nick out of the bar that Tuesday night in front of a large crowd that was there. Created quite a scene, as you can imagine. Small town, 270 people, six or seven police officers storming the bar. They pull Nick out of the bar and tell him that he's being arrested for a double murder. And I'm not going to repeat the words that Nick said, but our listeners can, understand Nick's frustration with, with what he had just been told. But so Nick gets put into a squad car, and he's driven back to the Cass County Sheriff's Office, where he's told that he has been charged as being arrested for this brutal double murder. And unlike Matt, Nick refuses to participate in the interview. I mean, he tells law enforcement that he's innocent, that he didn't commit these crimes, but he wants a lawyer, and really doesn't want to talk to these individuals.
So he remains in custody, though, doesn't he?
Yes. As far as pretty much from the moment that he gets that they raid the bar. Again, this was a little unorthodox, you would think. Most people would think, but Nick was never questioned. There was never any. They didn't go interview his fiance, future wife, and her roommate as well. They get interviewed that same night after Nick's already sitting in jail, charged with these two murders. That's when Nick's fiance at the time, Lori, and their other roommate, a girl named Ashley, they were interviewed late that night, and they maintained that Nick had to be home the same night that these murders had happened. Nick and his fiance had two big dogs, friendly dogs, but big dogs, that always slept in their bedroom at the foot of the bed. And Lori maintained that that absolutely no way that Nick had got out in the middle of the night that night. The dogs usually would bark at any opportunity that people were coming and going. And the other roommate, Ashley, had also maintained that, no, there's no way that Nick left that night. He was still in bed and got up ready for work that next morning that this happened. But at that point in time, though, Dan, their alibi witnesses really were immaterial for law enforcement. Nick was in jail. Matt had named him as his accomplice, and it was continue onward with the prosecution of Matt Livers and Nick Sampson.
Now they proceed ahead, and like you say, they're doing the investigation backwards. It basically, in terms of they haven't questioned him, and they haven't. They're looking at interviewing people that they should have interviewed before, but they're doing it after the fact. Now they have this information that the car, the getaway vehicle, was Will Sampson's vehicle. So what do they do with that information and his vehicle, and how does that work? How does that proceed for them?
Well, and I should point out too that Will's car was ultimately impounded in the middle of the first week of the investigation, probably the third or the fourth day of the case. Will's car was taken into custody, and it was driven to a crime lab in Omaha, where it was processed. And the car at the first go around came back as clean. There was no evidence, no blood, no blood spatter, no other fragments or tissue or anything like that. Nothing that indicated, that jumped out to the crime lab that this car was involved in the murders. However, local law enforcement officials just were in disbelief. They couldn't believe that this was the case. Their first thought was that this car, had to be cleaned, and it actually had been cleaned. The car, part of the reason why the car drew suspicion was the fact that it was dropped off at a detail shop, a cleaning shop, on the morning that the bodies were discovered, and that was part of the reason why law enforcement kind of zeroed in on this car. However, Nick, the car owner, maintained that there was no way that anybody borrowed his car. He had the one and only key to the car, and his fiancée, eventual wife, Alyn, also told law enforcement there was no way that anybody could have borrowed this car, either from her husband. But again, the car was taken into custody, and even when the car came back with no obvious evidence inside of it, the lead investigators tell the crime lab in Omaha to keep the car impounded, and that it still was their theory that this was the getaway car that Matt Livers and Nick Sampson had used to commit the murders.
Wow. So this is very, very important. We, of course, if the audience can remember, we alluded to it in the synopsis for the book. It's a very important detail. David Kofod is from this prestigious unit that does this important work, and they've done some great work, apparently, and solved all kinds of cases. David Kofod, and I want to ask you, too, I was really curious. Again, you can't go into everything in the book, but is it common practice for what David Kofod does, what he did do alone, in terms of checking out this vehicle again? Is that standard procedure to go ahead and do something like this alone? And then tell us the whole background story about how he became involved and what he found.
The answer to that question, as far as there were some times when it makes sense for for the crime lab officials to do their own work, but what really stood out was the fact that it was unorthodox to be doing follow-up tests on evidence that was tested the first time, that was already tested once, and came back as being excluded. That there was no sign that any blood or trace evidence or DNA was found on something, whether that was a knife, a gun, a sword. and certainly in this case in a car. So the fact that this car was already checked, and he supervised a search that wasn't 5 minutes long, Dan, but 6 to 8 hours long, from about midnight to about 8 a.m. He supervised this search of the car and had a couple of his best people working for him, carrying through that car, taking photograph after photograph of pretty much every spot in the car. And there were a few stains, there were a few substances found in the car, but they just turned out to be immaterial. They weren't blood, and they certainly weren't any DNA or any spatter that came from the crime scene. But Dave Colford, at that point in time, we're talking 2006. Dave was already had built up a pretty grandiose reputation across Nebraska, and certainly throughout that region, including Iowa. Nebraska and Iowa are pretty close to each other, I should say Omaha. And so Dave would also work a lot of, his unit would work a lot of cases in Iowa as well. But Dave Colford and his crime lab were building up this important reputation as being able to solve pretty much every case that a local law enforcement agency called them on to help out. And some of these were amazing and very, very high-profile crimes, Dan, that were all over the news, covered by us newspaper journalists and the TV and radio stations as well. And all these cases ended up with the bad guy going to prison, or ended up on death row in some cases. But in a lot of these cases as well, Dave Colford plays a key role in finding some piece of evidence or crucial pieces of evidence that ultimately help seal the deal, kind of get law enforcement or the prosecutor's office over the hump. And he's a very good testifier, very eloquent speaker, public speaker, very chatty and witty, and very smart individual. And he liked the limelight, and he also liked to boast and brag about the successes of his crime lab that he had managed and was really building up. And that's why you have a situation where a small town agency like the Cass County Sheriff's Office immediately called in the Douglas County Sheriff's Office crime lab because they wanted Dave Colford, and they wanted Dave Colford to work their case. And it becomes a head-scratcher for the lead investigators when the first time that Dave Colford supervises the search of the suspected getaway car, that there's no evidence in this car. Dave Colford ultimately goes back after Matt Livers and Nick Sampson have been in jail for a few days. He goes back on his own and ultimately reports back to one of the lead investigators that same evening that I found some blood underneath the dashboard of the car. And the lead investigator ultimately comes out to the sheriff's office that night. Dave shows him where he finds the blood. And that investigator kind of reacted with this, this is an unbelievable, this is a needle in the haystack kind of find. But it kind of matched Dave Colford's reputation and the fact that the lead investigators were absolutely convinced that this was the getaway car to begin with. So that's kind of the way that things proceed from that point on. Dave now had found some blood in the car, after all, blood that came from the murder victim, Wayne Stock, to corroborate Matt Livers' confession that this was the getaway car that he and Nick Sampson had used to commit these murders.
And so it looks like the case closed, but there's more to the story. Now, I know this is jumping ahead, but we only go about another half an hour into this incredible twisting tale. Tell us how, with all of this evidence stacked up against these men, how it comes to be that there is a CSI officer, investigator, that notices something in a photo.
It It's a fluke, basically, and it's an unbelievable fluke. But we have a situation where the lead investigators were just puzzled that knowing that this was such a brutal crime scene, they figured that the killers, they were thinking it was Matt Livers and Nick Sampson, had to have gotten an incredible amount of blood spray and stains all over their clothes and inside this car. Well, again, as we talked about earlier, they do everything backwards. So they arrest Nick Sampson and Matt Livers and then search and raid their houses and take all their clothes, take all their shoes, and can't find no blood anywhere is found on any of the clothing or garments or anywhere, from the two properties where Matt Livers and Nick Sampson lived. So they're still trying to figure out kind of what other key pieces of evidence that were left that they could possibly link Matt Livers and Nick Sampson to from the crime scene. And they're going through these photographs. Those hundreds of photographs that Don Bays from the Douglas County Crime Lab had taken. And one of the photographs, an obscure photograph of the kitchen, ultimately catches the eye of one of the detectives from Cass County. And he notices in the photograph that there's a shiny object. And he sees it and this is a photo of the kitchen. And he notices the shiny object, and he points this out. A couple other investigators, I believe, agreed with him. Yeah, it looks like there is something there. And again, this is the fourth day of the case. So the crime lab had already kind of closed up shop and left the farmhouse. But law enforcement goes back out to this farmhouse, and lo and behold, the shiny object was still there on the floor. And the shiny object happened to be a gold ring, an engraved ring, that had the names, it said, Love Always, Corey, C-O-R-I, and Ryan, R-Y-A-N. And investigators were puzzled by this, and they asked family members who Corey and Ryan could be, and none of the grieving family members could identify anybody that they could think of named Corey and Ryan. The DNA is tested on this ring. Matt Livers and Nick Sampson, since they were in jail, their DNA was matched up to this ring, and actually another piece of evidence too from the property. But law enforcement is in for another major shocker when the DNA on this ring turns out to exclude Matt Livers and Nick Sampson. Now, at that point in time, Cass County Sheriff's Office isn't thinking, oh my God, we arrested the wrong two people for these murders, because they, are still convinced that their confession was airtight, and bulletproof. But they're thinking that this just proves that Nick Sampson and Matt Livers must have had other people that helped them out in these murders. Mm-hmm. And it just happens to be a matter of time before they're eventually going to figure out who these other people would be.
Now, keeping with that theory, again, they think what? They think, who do they go to as their likely co-conspirators in this in their mind?
First, they worked off of Matt Livers. Really only had one close friend at that point in life, and it was a fellow that lived in the state of Texas, whose name was Ryan Paulding. And again, that was the only Ryan that anybody could even think of that matched, name matched up with the name on the ring. But and Matt had spent a few weeks with Ryan prior to the murders. So again, they're thinking that, this Ryan had to be at the crime scene as well. He probably helped Matt plan this thing out. But so law enforcement works with the Texas Rangers, and they interview Ryan Paulding, obtain his DNA samples as well, but they don't match up. And Ryan was clearly in the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas at the time of the murders. So they back off Ryan Paulding, but they're not convinced that he's completely innocent or has nothing to do with this. They think that eventually, that maybe Ryan still might know something, but for the time being, they back off of Ryan. But he's the first person they think about And then the other one that they were still kind of working off of was Will Sampson, Nick's brother. But again, nothing was really pointing to Will as being ultimately out as well, participating in the murder. So locally, everything is kind of hitting dead ends. They also looked at the possibility too, Dan, that Matt Livers and Nick Sampson's fiancées, Sarah and Lori, possibly that they were, at the farmhouse at the time of the murders. But again, that doesn't hold any weight or water either. So everything that they're looking at locally just is not coming together for them.
Now tell us about Jim Rohr and how he gets involved and how this really starts unraveling and we get to the truth eventually here. So tell us about Jim Rohr, who he works with, and tell us a little bit about him and how he gets involved in this.
Jim Rohr was in the state of Wisconsin. He was a small town detective for a town of about, in a county of, the city was about 25,000, but a small county, a little bit bigger than Cass County, Nebraska. But he gets a call about a month after this murder had happened from Nebraska authorities. And at that point in time, they had determined that a ring, that ring that had been dropped at the farmhouse with the name Corey and Ryan, had ultimately traced back to the state of Wisconsin, and it had come from a Walmart store in Dodge County, Wisconsin. And at that point in time, it was kind of like a collision course of two completely separate criminal investigations that neither law enforcement entity kind of knew about the other up until now. When Jim Rohr gets the call about this ring that had been found in Nebraska, Jim Rohr had already been investigating a slew of local auto thefts. And there were several vehicles, 3 or 4, that had been taken over a matter of a few days in the Dodge County, Wisconsin jurisdiction. And Jim Rohr already had a pair of teenagers, Greg Fester and Jessica Reed, in custody for these vehicle thefts. And it was clear to Jim Rohr that this ring had come from one of those vehicles that was stolen, because the ring had been given to a fellow by the name of Ryan Krenz, who was about 20 or 21 years old at that point in time. And Ryan Krenz happened to be the owner of a big red Dodge Ram pickup truck that had been stolen the day before Easter by this pair of Wisconsin teenagers. And this truck was ultimately abandoned in the state of Louisiana about 4 or 5 days later, and it was stolen. So Jim Rohr ultimately kind of really digs into these two local suspects, Greg Fester and Jessica Reed, and he does some amazing, excellent detective work. He thinks that there's a chance that they're involved in these murders in Nebraska, but he needs to be very careful not to tip them off that he's looking at them as murder suspects. So he ultimately uses a couple different ruses, or tricks them basically. It's all legal, but he goes up to them and tells them that he was looking at. He took a phone call from an agency in Iowa that was looking at the possibility that they may have ransacked and burglarized a house in Iowa, and that agency needed to compare their DNA. So Jim Rohr is able to get DNA samples from Greg Fester and Jessica Reed, and he doesn't send those to Iowa because he never got a call from Iowa yet. But he sends those back to the state of Nebraska, and lo and behold, 2 key pieces of evidence. One was the ring. The second was a dope pipe that was left in the driveway of the farmhouse. But both those key pieces of physical evidence happen to include the DNA samples that were a bullseye for Greg Fester and Jessica Reed. Now, this is about 2 full months into the murder investigation. So now it becomes clear that 2 other people are involved, and that's where all the physical evidence is starting to line up. They weren't from Nebraska. They were from 500 miles away in the state of Wisconsin. These teenagers named Greg Fester and Jessica Reed, aged 19 and 17 at the time.
Now, we just skipped over, and it's an incredible part of your book too. And I think that we have to give this is such a, again, when you talk about the CSI agent looking at a photo and seeing some sparkle and something really shining, and then going back to a farmyard that had been thoroughly searched. Again, in light of all the sloppiness with some great police work, but this is a citizen, not a police officer, this Mary Martino, and she works at A&I Jewelers. And so we just go back just a little bit because she's got an incredible story of just due diligence and helping out the police with this. Tell us her story, because it really warrants inclusion, I think.
Yeah, we had a situation where the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, the crime lab in Omaha, based out of Omaha, ultimately had possession of that ring. And one of the forensic scientists makes a phone call to this A&I Jewelers in Buffalo, New York. Really, because this was kind of about the last-ditch effort that anybody could make to figure out who this ring belonged to. And if this call doesn't materialize, who knows where, that's just going to become a dead end in the case, frankly. And this Mary Martino takes the phone call, and she was the operations manager of this jewelry manufacturer that was on the brink of bankruptcy and closing down, shutting off its lights, and disconnecting its telephone a matter of days later. But Mary takes this call from this desperate-sounding CSI official, and she hears the words, this is a Nebraska double homicide, and she decides to drop everything else that she's doing at the time with her job and really just bears down and really digs into trying to figure out if there is a receipt that can figure out who bought this engraved ring. And she goes through box after box after box, and just becomes exhausted and frustrated because she's getting nowhere. And at that point in time, Dan, she could have given up and just said, "The heck with this! It's not worth it's not worth the time and effort. I got a million other things to do, especially closing down this business." Nebraska and New York aren't exactly next door neighbors, and she'd never been to Nebraska, and she didn't know any of these people, so she didn't even, frankly, have to call them back, and there was nothing they could do. But she continues onward and becomes ingenious, and ultimately works with other people in her company that I believe were out of Toronto, if I'm not mistaken, and they help her put together a computer grid. And long story short is that within a few days, they ultimately figure out that this engraved ring, this Love Always Corey and Ryan ring, was a $129 ring that had come from a Walmart, had been sold at a Walmart store in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, a town of about 20,000 people. And
Incredible.
This ring was bought by a girl that was about 18 or 19 at the time, named Corey Zastro. And she bought this ring for her boyfriend at the time, a young farmer named Ryan Krenz, who was 20 or 21 at the time. And, that she bought it for him around Christmas time, and their relationship fizzled shortly thereafter that. And, Ryan didn't want to wear that ring around anymore, since they weren't going together. So what does he do? But he just puts the ring into his glove box in his truck to kind of forget about it, And unfortunately, a year and a half later, his truck gets stolen on Easter, on the night before Easter. And the truck gets driven through several different states and ultimately ends up in Louisiana. But it's because of the heroics and unbelievable investigative work by a civilian named Mary Martino that's what is kind of the key moment in this case, the breakthrough moment, Dan, of this case, is when Mary Martino identifies that this ring came from not Nebraska, but Wisconsin, and it came from a Walmart store. That's kind of what really kind of breaks the ice in this case, and really from that moment forward, it's all about Wisconsin, and it's not about Nebraska in this Nebraska double murder case.
Now, as we see in many other cases, and this will be another great example of people not wanting to admit they were wrong or refusing to believe that they were wrong, one way or another. Now, they have the two suspects. Before I get into the interview of those two suspects, what do they think they have now with these two suspects, with the DNA proof and the connection through the stolen vehicle and the people sitting in prison? What's their idea then?
Their theory at that point in time becomes, these two scumbags from Wisconsin must have come to Nebraska, been recruited here to carry out these murders or bring the weapons, but just somehow that Matt Livers and Nick Sampson had conspired with these two thugs out of Wisconsin, and they can't see it any other way but that. And so when Jim Rohr had ultimately determined, that the DNA came back for sure to Greg Fester and Jessica Reed, the two lead investigators from Nebraska get in a vehicle and ultimately drive up to Wisconsin here. And when they sit down and meet Jessica Reed and Greg Fester separately to interview them and interrogate them, they're not thinking that these are necessarily the people that were the shooters. They're thinking that these were, helpful participants of Matt Livers and Nick Sampson. And they can't get it out of their mind that that Jessica Reed and Greg Fester don't know these other people. So when they bring up these, they bring with them a handful of stock photographs of Matt and Nick, and even Nick's brother Will, and another fella who gets pulled into this as well, unfortunately, named Tom Todd. Greg and Jessica look at these photos, and mainly the ones of Matt and Nick, and they can't identify these people. They don't know who they are. And the lead investigators from Nebraska are flabbergasted. They just think that they're BSing them and just lying to them. And and they tell them, you're going to get the death penalty, and we're not going to be able to go easy on you, and just pressing them, and trying to intimidate them into implicating Matt Livers and Nick Sampson as their co-conspirators. So it becomes very complex and it's a very muddy part of the case at this point in time, Dan. But they're ultimately going to refuse to believe Jessica and Greg when they're initially telling them that, no, it's just us. We were the only two that were involved in these murders.
Now, you say that there's so many people that do the right thing, and you're saying during this that a couple public defenders really set the prosecutor straight, because unlike a prosecutor normally working hand in hand right from the very beginning of an investigation, the prosecutor of Matt Livers and the Sampson brother are really basically going on whatever the police gave them, whatever information they gave them. So the public defenders, again, do an admirable job of kind of informing and educating the prosecutors so that...
Right. In this case, they really had to play the role of detective and investigator for the prosecutor's office and law enforcement. And at that point in time, when the Wisconsin break occurs and Greg Fester and Jessica Reed get charged with these double murders, but their clients are not released from custody, they realized that this initial statement or confession from Matt Livers clearly was dubious, and very, very suspect. And they were convinced that their clients were not guilty of these crimes and didn't know Greg and Jessica. So they really turned on the offensive and really did their own investigation and really dug into various aspects of the case and really determined that there was no way that Matt and Nick had any involvement. And then they basically went through and went through Matt's confession. The videotape, which the cops thought was their, really got them over the hump, this videotape confession, really turns out to be the biggest detriment for law enforcement in this case, because this confession, when they really went through it, really was a disaster. And Matt never mentioned in his confession Greg Fester and Jessica Reed, the two people whose DNA was in fact left at the crime scene, the two individuals, that pretty much overwhelming physical evidence lined up against, including their own admissions and confessions that they were the ones that were responsible, and they didn't know anybody else that was at these murders. And it really was a credit to the two public defenders, Julie Baer and Jerry Soucy, that they really sought out some outside national experts to help them out on the phenomenon, which is known as false confessions, and they were able to bring in distinguished psychologist out of Ohio named Dr. Scott Bressler. And Scott was able to interview Matt Livers and really dissect the confession. And Dr. Bressler put together a formal report for the court that concluded that Matt's confession was not reliable. That it was a false confession, and that this was obtained under duress, and that was one of those individuals that was highly susceptible to police coercion and intimidation, and ultimately the confession, like I mentioned earlier, just really didn't amount to anything. It really was not a legitimate confession, like you normally would see and expect, Dan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing that they could look at that confession and go woohoo. Meanwhile, it's almost like a textbook of what not to do, and here's how to get a false confession from.
Unfortunately, that's right. No, that's true, and like I said, there was really a lot of holes in it. When I think Dr. Bressler determined, I think there was over 100 different times that Matt Livers had ultimately steadfastly denied that he had any involvement in these murders. And normally when a suspect is innocent, that's one thing that usually stands out to good detectives and good investigators. If the person is innocent, they'll be very adamant and very forceful and very persuasive in maintaining, no, I didn't do it. I had nothing to do with these crimes. And that's the way Matt Livers was for a long time until he ultimately gets fooled, on the polygraph test where he's told that he flunked it, it was the worst polygraph that investigator had ever seen, and ultimately goes along with their theory that he committed these murders, and was initially willing to take credit for doing the murders by himself. And those guys at least were smart enough to know that that wasn't possible, but it just really was a helpless situation for him, and it really does go to show that these things unfortunately do happen from time to time, and law enforcement does need to be vigilant and verify statements rather than just take the word of an individual that he or she committed a crime and leave it at that.
Now, obviously, just like we talked about in the synopsis, now people would logically look at David Colford with the ultimate question: how on earth, David, did this DNA get in the vehicle? And everybody in the audience would probably love to hear what really was his response. What was his explanation? How on earth that could have happened?
Well, at first he had kind of quietly drifted away from the case. While the whole Fester and Reed prosecution was moving forward, he was working on another case that I mentioned at the end of the book, another huge murder case involving that Jessica O'Grady. But ultimately, when the case is resolved, the questions come back to him because naturally he was the individual that purported to find this blood in this car that now is clearly determined to have nothing to do with the murders. It was clear that the truck that Greg Fester and Jessica Reed stole in Wisconsin was the getaway vehicle. So all eyes kind of come back to Dave Kofod, and it starts with the prosecutor. And it's at that point in time when Dave comes forward and this time has an alternative theory, and he maintains that it had to be the result of cross-contamination or some type of accidental transfer, that somehow, some way, since it was a very messy and bloody crime scene, that through no fault of his own or any of his highly skilled and top-notch investigators from the crime lab, but somehow somebody got some blood from the crime scene onto the crime lab's equipment. And when Dave Kofod goes out to check that car the second time, that somehow he already had blood, contaminated blood, on his filter paper when he went and checked that dashboard. So that becomes his theory to explain how the blood of the murder victim suddenly had showed up inside the car of a person that had nothing to do with these murders. And that's kind of the way it stayed for a while. And kind of the next big change in the case is when one of the civil lawsuits gets filed in federal court, alleging police misconduct in the case, for the wrongful arrests of Matt Livers and Nick Sampson. One of the allegations that gets made in the civil lawsuit, Dan, involves the claim or the belief that blood had gotten into Will Sampson's car by some unknown law enforcement official who planted the blood in the car. And it's at that point in time that the Federal Bureau of Investigation office out of Omaha kind of raises their eyebrows and takes a serious, hard look at this case. And they start with working with the Douglas County Crime Lab, and the second person they interview happens to be Dave Kofod. And they tell Dave Kofod, after he tries to give them this story again, that they tell him that his story just doesn't pass the smell test. And it's at that point or around that point in time that Dave Kofod just becomes defiant and cuts off the interview with the FBI and tells them he's going to get a lawyer. And that, frankly, becomes the last time that Dave Kofod has any involvement or interaction with the FBI related to this case.
Yeah, and you go on to talk about there's a lawsuit and it's substantial, significant money. I'm more interested, and I think the audience is too, is that the motivation for this senseless crime. You talk about comparisons to other, Charles Starkweather, Crime Spree, and that's what this was. So tell us about this, what this really started out as and what it ended up as according to the killers themselves and from the investigators after they did get on track with finding the real perpetrators. If there was any sense to this thing, tell us about it.
There's a lot of different theories on this, Dan. But by the time the case goes to ultimately to sentencing, the theory that the prosecutor works off of, that this was a random crime. That Wayne and Sharmon Stock, the farmers, were clearly picked out, in random fashion, and that is absolutely true. It's so unfortunate, but it's true. Their farmhouse was targeted, and they became the unfortunate victims as well of a brutal and senseless double murder that was committed in random fashion. However, the thinking at that point in time was that this was a burglary that went awry, that went horribly bad. But there really is no evidence that shows that Greg Fester and Jessica Reed tried to steal anything or that they did take anything at that house that night. And Greg Fester and Jessica Reed were very big drug users at that point in time. They dropped the marijuana pipe in the driveway. They were heavy in the drugs. But they were also really kind of engaged in becoming more bold and more daring in the different crimes that they were committing over the last several weeks. And the one theory is that this that they were kind of building up to these crimes, and there may have even been, as strange as this sounds, kind of an arousal factor where Jessica and Greg were getting excited and becoming aroused, by committing an awful double murder such as this. And that's based on conversations I've had after the book came out actually with Jim Rohrer, the detective. He pointed out that based on his interviews that he did with Jessica Reed, just how she kind of put his hand on his hand, when she was recalling certain aspects of the crime afterwards, and just talking about, you just had to be there, So as strange as that sounds, that is a possibility. But another theory, and this is kind of the one that I worked off of, in my book, was kind of just going straight off of Greg Fester's own words at the time of, that he was going to be sentenced, trying to make sense of all this. And he basically just, very short, but just said that we were there for the thrill, I guess. So I think it's very possible, too, that this was just a thrill kill by these two, given the propensity of violence, given the other crimes that they were committing, and other people that they were preying on, other farmhouses that they had broken into just a matter of hours earlier. That basically this becomes a thrill kill for them, and I know that's incredible and hard for people to believe, and and it's scary that something like that could happen to any one of us. But that's, I think that's a very good possibility. Is why these murders have happened, unfortunately, Dan.
Yeah, it seems incredible that, as you describe in the book, that they shot Wayne in the leg, as I guess he was trying to get out of the bed. They were startled in bed, like you say, most likely, absolutely. And she was trying to call on the phone, and they shot her right in the face. They shot him in the leg, and then shot him in the head, and then shot him again in the head.
Right.
Thrill kill.
Yeah. He took 3 shots, and the thing is that Jessica Reed, one of her shots probably was the one that was responsible for killing Wayne during a struggle with Fester over the gun between Fester and Wayne Stock. But Fester ultimately fires another shot into the back of Wayne's head after he was probably already dead. And again, working off of Fester and Reed, that really seems to kind of be their MO. It seems like that this really was something that they were looking forward to doing at some point in time. They just didn't even realize, as crazy as this sounds, Dan, that they were in the state of Nebraska at the time that these murders had happened. They still thought that they were in the state of Iowa because they had remembered breaking into a farmhouse there a matter of hours earlier.
Yeah, well, senseless murder. But, the story really illustrates and demonstrates that there's a lot of people that need to hang their head in shame here by railroading people, not doing good police work at all, in fact, doing bad police work on David Kofod. But there are these unsung heroes, and fate intervened on behalf of these victims, I would believe, and justice in general. Again, it's amazing how many stories I do cover, and it seems like fate intervenes. I hate to get all, I don't know what the word is, but it just seems there's no other explanation but somebody like Mary Martino or, a very, very observant CSI agent, and otherwise these things would be unsolved completely.
And that's true. And I mean, Darnell Cush, for example, one of the CSIs that had worked, kind of been in the doghouse for Dave Kofod for a number of years. She's ultimately the one that's going to go to the FBI because she had made complaints up the chain of command against Dave Kofod over a number of years under the premise that she thought there was something suspicious or shady about him on other cases, not involving necessarily blood planting, but just other things involving fingerprints, and fake accommodation letters that she thought that he was writing and putting in his own file. And, without her going forward to the FBI, that's another part of the case. Whether or not he would have been prosecuted or whether or not, the FBI would have moved forward without having someone like her go to them is really unknown. But you're right that there's a handful of people that just did phenomenal, excellent work in this case, from the prosecutor Clarence Mock that prosecuted Colford to Detective Jim Aurora in Wisconsin to Mary Martino, but there's also a handful of law enforcement officials in the Cass County Sheriff's Office and the Nebraska State Patrol, that should just be ashamed of themselves, for their performance. Just abysmal work that they did on this case, sadly, but it's true.
Well, I got to publicly shame the 6 relatives that were absolutely certain that their relative was guilty of this heinous murder as well. And you got to look at a victim of somebody with an IQ of 70 in special ed, and you got to really feel for this guy too, because I guess you can't really quantify the trauma and the damage they did to this guy by twisting his brain around and getting him to sign a confession and this whole thing. And no amount of money will ever compensate him or his cousin either in being involved in this. So there's a lot of shame to go around, like you say.
That's true. And that's a good point too, Dan, is that even after, as incredible as this sounds for listeners, but even when it becomes 100% clear that Greg Fester and Jessica Reed were the killers, for the next several years, this myth was still perpetuated in Nebraska by that sheriff's office and by several of those family members that Matt Livers and Nick Sampson were somehow ultimately involved in these crimes as well. They just would not let it go, and part of it was probably, out of they looked horrible as far as just being so foolish and wrong, after the fact. But they wouldn't let it go, and have refused, I think, to this day to still make amends with those 2 cousins, Dan. So.
Yeah, incredible. Well, the one good thing is that we have programs like this that may run for years and years, where people will get the true story behind this. And your fine book, of course, Bloody Lies, tells the true story, and that's why it's so valuable to not get a little snapshot of stories, because that's misleading. Not get all of the information and not get all the evidence and rush to judgment at all. So it's great to have these books, and nobody can write fiction this crazy. It's just amazing. So I want to thank you very much, John, for coming on. For those that want further information or would like to contact you or Facebook you or get more information about this or some of the other work that you do, how may they contact you, and tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. The couple different options would be I have a Facebook page which is True Crime Author John Farrick. You can follow me and like me there. I also have a true crime website, which I go into great detail about different aspects of Bloody Lies, and I do a fair number of question and answers with other individuals that were involved in this case and other cases as well. And my website is johnfarrick.com. You can contact me through the website there as well. And I'm also on Twitter. My handle is John Farrick. So those are different ways on social media for people to reach me and contact me.
Yes. Well, thanks very much, John. Thank you very much. Great book, Bloody Lies, and thanks for coming on and talking about it tonight. And you have yourself a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dan.
Thank you. Good night.
Have a great night. Bye. Good night.